This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft as she breaks down livestock risk protection and how cattle producers can use it as a risk management tool. Jeff Whitworth, K-State crop entomologist, continues the show as he explains what questions he has been receiving about armyworms and fall armyworms. He says what people can do for control. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk ends the show as he says determining the right time to harvest corn silage in Kansas depends on a variety of factors. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show talking about livestock risk protection with K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft. Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Jenny, as we're talking about livestock risk protection, also commonly referred to just as LRP, what is it?
Well, I think the simplest explanation is that this is price insurance for cattle and hog producers. We do have some folks that use it for hogs in Kansas, but it is mostly for cattle. If you're familiar with futures markets or hedging, you could simply think of it as a lower cost put option. It works very similar to that.
How long has this been around?
Actually, it's been a while, 2003. I think I found an article by Jim Minert from 2005 on AgManager once. But yeah, it's been around for a long time, but use was pretty low for a couple decades. What happened was there was increases in the premium subsidy. So the federal government started paying a larger share of the cost in 2019 and 2020. So after it was made more affordable for producers, you saw use really go up. The other thing that happened, so let's go back to 2020, is just a general, you've had higher prices for cattle. Generally, especially now, and also just market volatility and uncertainty. So I think these are both driving why producers are using it more today.
Have there been other factors that have also maybe encouraged producers to use this insurance more?
This is a part of the federal crop insurance program. So like all other products, it's sold by private crop insurance agents. They've played a large role with, their promotional efforts. Some have developed decision tools for producers to use. So they've played a large role into this, and you can see this in the current market share, estimated market share. So for 2025 already, we have over 500,000 head of feeder cattle covered by livestock risk protection. So over 500,000. Sounds like a large number, but what does it exactly mean? It's a little bit over 40% of the 2024 calf crop. But 40% isn't quite the market share because, you could use it to cover the calves that are born in Kansas, but you also have calves coming into the state. Say they're going to a stocker operation in the Flint Hills, and you could use LRP for those. So I guess the market share is about 30%, which, in 5 years going from next to nothing to 30% is pretty big.
Is this only for feeder cattle, or can it be used for other types of cattle as well?
We mainly talk about feeder cattle, but the two categories are feeder cattle and fed cattle. So they're classified. If you cover cattle under 1,000 pounds, you're covering it as feeder cattle. If it's above 1,000 pounds, you're covering it as fed cattle. Again, you can also use it for hogs.
Why might someone want to use this?
It does look like cattle prices are going to be high for a while, given everything that we know. And if you're a cattle producer that's, also gone through some years of lower negative profits, hopefully that lasts for a while. But generally, producers do manage price risk during high price periods and low price periods. So the fear right now is that you have a surprise and prices drop.
Is this maybe something producers want to use on just a few cattle potentially so they could cover for sure their fixed costs?
There's a lot of different approaches to there's a lot of different approaches to how you manage price risk. LRP is one alternative, and then once you use LRP, you can decide how much of your herd you want to use it on. In terms of managing price risk, some producers will prefer to self-insure. So they may not want to pay extra for managing risk. So they're going to have other sources of income that they use to manage that risk. Some producers could use futures and options. Some may have special marketing arrangements. So say they're working with a feed yard or a processor or direct marketing, and that can play a role in managing price risk. But if you do choose to use livestock risk protection, you don't have to cover the full price, or you don't have to cover all animals in your herd. You can cover as many head as you want. You could cover, you could get the maximum possible price protection available. Or you could say, okay, this is my break-even price. I'm just going to cover it at that level. Or you may want more of a catastrophic price. So these are like if you do crop insurance for crops, it's like a coverage level. So I'm going to take the full maximum price, or I'm going to take 75% of the maximum price for more catastrophic coverage.
How does this program work in terms of getting signed up, having the cattle go through it, and getting paid?
Well, again, you work with a cropper. I guess it would be a livestock insurance agent in this case. A lot of times they're the same people. Some companies do specialize. First of all, you just sign up for it. So you're not committing to buying anything. You're just signing up to sort of establish your eligibility. And then once you're signed up, it's sort of like playing the futures market. So every day around 3 p.m., the possible contracts, the possible prices are going to post, and you have to decide if you want to buy a contract, and that has to get finished by the next morning. So you kind of have to have a strategy in place, and that's something you could work with your insurance agent to do.
Are there minimums or maximums for the amount of head that can be used in LRP?
There is a maximum. I think it's 25,000. So, if you're a cow-calf producer in Kansas, it's probably not relevant, maybe for some of the feed yards, but you insure by the head. And I think this is one point for smaller producers where LRP is potentially more small producer friendly, because you could insure, 1 head to 50 head to, 20 head, whatever works for you. If you want to go out and use the futures markets or buy an option, you have to buy those contracts in 50,000 pound increments. So it might be hard if you're a smaller producer for that to match your needs. The other part of LRP is you pay for your premium. There is a premium. So you're paying to offset the risk. There is a premium at the end of the coverage period. So you're not paying that premium up front. So, you may even have your calf check in hand before you have to pay that cost.
Are there other things that you'd also like producers to know about LRP before they start thinking through it?
If a producer is considering an LRP contract, you're going to be looking at both the costs of LRP, but as also it's ensuring the potential price you could receive, which affects your revenue. I think it's important to take both of those into account. So you can use LRP up to almost a year out. So it can cover up to 52-week contracts or endorsements. So I looked at the prices, the current prices offered for the heaviest possible steer and an unborn calf. I want to go through those to kind of give producers an understanding of how it works. So let's say you are insuring feeder cattle at the highest possible weight, 1,000 pounds. A year out, the price that's being offered for LRP, that's based on futures markets, is $300 a hundredweight. So a 1,000-pound animal, that's $3,000. If you want to buy LRP, it's $13 a hundredweight. So that's $130 per head. So you could say, do I want to spend $130 per head, or do I want to make sure that the revenue I get doesn't go below $2,870? That's the same thing. That's the same outcome. But when you see those numbers, $130 a head, or I'm going to pay something so, I don't end up with less than $2,870 per animal, that's a different, those feel different. So it's important to keep that in mind. You can both look at the cost and what's your final revenue outcome. There's no right way to do it. It's just important to keep in mind that your perception can change. It's the same thing if you're insuring unborn calves. So those prices are even higher. If you go a year out, the price for an unborn calf is $315 per hundredweight. That's even higher. But it costs almost $15 a hundredweight. So what does this translate to if you want to insure a 500-pound calf? So, $1,575 for that unborn calf. That's the value of what you're insuring. But you could also look at it it costs $75 a head. So it's almost $15 for hundredweight, $75 per animal. The other way to look at it is this is a $1,500 price revenue floor. So again, perception matters. Prices are really high. When prices are high, premiums are high. There's more that you're protecting.
And really wanting to hit home that this is just a tool in a toolbox that producers have the option of using.
Absolutely. It's one thing that's out there, for producers who, want to, really at the end of the day, it's are you willing to pay something to protect yourself against a surprise in the market? Or do you want to manage it another way? There are a lot of other things that we talk about a lot that producers can do to manage this risk.
Is there a specific sign-up window for LRP?
There's not a specific deadline. The deadline is every day. So you can buy it after the market's closed, before the market's open the next day. And then that contract is gone. And then after the markets are open again and closed, there's a new contract that gets posted. The markets aren't open. There's no LRP available. So it's really like, having a marketing or hedging strategy and letting that play out.
If people want to read more on this or learn more on this, what's your recommendation?
If you have an insurance agent you're comfortable with, you can talk to them. You can go to the RMA website to look for livestock agents. We have resources on AgManager.info. We just put an article in the Beef Tips newsletter. So, today there's a lot of resources out there on LRP.
Jenny, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Absolutely.
That was K-State Flinchbaugh Agricultural Policy Chair Jenny Ifft. I will link the resources that she mentioned in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned back into Agriculture Today, and we continue our show talking about armyworms and fall armyworms with K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. Jeff, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure, anytime.
Jeff, you've started receiving a lot of calls about armyworms and fall armyworms, and why is that?
Because there's a lot of them around right now, apparently, especially in south central Kansas. The two are very much alike. The two larvae are very much alike. They feed just about the same. The life cycle is just about the same. The amount of food they need to go clear through the larval stage is about the same. So I will kind of lump them together. It doesn't, right at this time of the year, it doesn't really matter which one you have feeding. They're going to both feed pretty voraciously on whatever your yard or your garden or your crop, whatever it is. The difference is fall armyworms don't overwinter in Kansas. They come up every year on the wind in the spring, so they're generally a little later to arrive here than armyworms. But armyworms, they apparently do overwinter in Kansas, and still they don't overwinter in vast numbers usually. So again, it takes them a little while to build up their populations, which this is, I think, about the second generation. For this year, there probably maybe, again, it depends on the weather. There may be another, at least one or two more generations of either one this year. But generally, the armyworm will stay longer feeding into the fall than the fall armyworm because, as I said, the fall armyworm, they migrate south as adults, so they generally leave a little bit earlier than armyworms. Armyworms can stay here and overwinter as larvae. But right now, it doesn't matter. Right now, they're feeding on, most of the calls I'm getting are from south central Kansas, a couple from north central. Remember, I just said we got another generation or two to go, so we're not out of the woods. They're still going to maybe migrate further north or further west or, who knows. Right now, the larvae that I've seen are relatively large, which means they have almost completed their feeding, so they're not going to feed and they're not going to cause much more damage. What you need to do is get out and monitor your yard or your crop or whatever it is you're worried about to see what stage they're in. It's going to be different for, a week or two. Egg laying can make a difference as far as how much longer the larvae are actually feeding. If they're relatively large larvae, by that I mean an inch and a quarter, they're not going to feed much more. So that has a big impact on when you want to treat, if you want to treat, or if you don't want to treat. If you're out looking in your yard, go out in the evening or the early morning. They're mainly nocturnal. They'll feed mainly at night. When it's hot, they're going to be in the shade just like we are. So you don't get an appreciation for how many are out there if you're out during the middle part of the day. So go out in the evening, take a flashlight, go out at night, and sample and see how many little worms are actually feeding on the grass or the crop or whatever it is. And they're actually feeding on it because they chew the grass. It's not going to kill the grass. It's just going to chew it so that it's gone, or the leaves. It's one of the questions I get is, do they transmit any diseases or do they vector any diseases? They do not, as far as I know. They chew the grass, they eat it, they remove it, and then once they're reached the adult or the mature larval stage, they will make a little hole in the soil or in the leaf litter or wherever, and they will pupate. Those pupate, the pupae don't feed. Once they've pupated, all the damage is over with. A majority of them will probably be in about the same stage at the same time as armyworms or fall armyworms. One of the reasons we call them that is because they kind of move all en masse at the same time, like an army moving. Once they've eaten most of the food in one place, they will move out as a whole large group and start feeding as they advance. So a lot of them will mature at the same time. By that I mean be mature larvae, and so a lot of them will pupate at the same time. So if the majority of them are pupating in whatever host you're worried about, your yard or your garden or your crop, don't spray. They're going to pupate. It's going to take, well, again, temperature completely drives development of insects. So 70, 65 to 90 degrees, it's going to take them 4 or 5 days to pupate. They're going to finish pupating. They're going to come out as a moth. Then they're going to mate. First thing that's on their mind is mating. They're going to mate. They're going to fly around and deposit eggs in some susceptible host, some susceptible food source, so that the larvae can feed. And that's going to take another week for those eggs to hatch. So if you've had considerable problems with them in your yard or your crop and you don't find any worms out there right now, just hold off for a couple of weeks. The moths will be back depositing eggs. That doesn't mean they're going to deposit eggs in the same sites that we're already fed upon. They may go someplace else. So that's why monitoring is very important. You need to get out to monitor, and you need to spray, if you're going to spray, while they're really small. That's when you get the best control. Once they've gotten large, they've already done most of the damage. They're just a little more difficult to kill, and they're not going to do much more damage anyway. So timing is very important, whether it's a fall armyworm or armyworm. Now, the easiest way to tell them apart, fall armyworm larva has 4 distinct spots on the last larval segment. 4 black, dark brown, dark gray, whatever you want to call them, distinct spots in kind of a square on the very last segment. Even when they're small, you can detect those. You know, I hear all these descriptions. Well, you got to look for the Y on the face or the broad or narrow stripe down the side. For years, we've tried to use those, and that's all relative. So the best way to tell them apart, fall armyworms has those 4 distinct black, dark gray spots in a square on the last larval segment. Armyworms don't. That's really not important right now, but it will be in another month or two because, like I said, fall armyworms don't overwinter in Kansas, so armyworms can. Armyworms sometimes will move into the new wheat crop also when it's planted in September, October, and they can cause a problem then if the weather hasn't gotten cold enough. By cold enough, I mean for most insects in Kansas, it has to get into the mid-20s for a couple of hours in order to dissuade or kill any insects from feeding on your yard or your crop or whatever it is. So keep that in mind. Right now, the ones I saw, they're probably finished feeding. It's probably going to be another 2 or 3 weeks before the little ones are out actively feeding again. So when you're out looking, monitoring your yard, your sweet corn, your sorghum, whatever it is, keep that in mind.
What does the moth look like?
Well, moths just kind of nondescript. Moths, you're not going to see the moth pretty much. They're out at night flying around. But if you look in our book, Crop Insects of Kansas, it has really good pictures of the adult fall armyworm and the adult armyworm moth. So if you see any, well, there are many different cutworm moths. Right now, it seems like in south central Kansas, if you see a lot of fairly heavy-bodied, robust, I guess you might say, moths flying around at night, or you out walking in your yard and these little brown moths fly up, that's probably the fall armyworm, at least from the reports I'm getting right now. But we have really good pictures in our Crop Insect of Kansas book.
You mentioned them potentially being in crops. You also mentioned sweet corn, potentially going to be in corn and soybeans, or more just garden produce?
Well, yes, that's a good question. As far as sweet corn right now, what we're having the main problem with in the eastern part of the state over to about 77 Highway are Japanese beetles, because they're out and they're feeding on silks. Apparently, some of the guys I've been talking to are having real problems in sweet corn because, as you know, a lot of sweet corn is sold as the ear looks perfectly aesthetically pleasing with no wormholes or anything in it, so they want to make sure nothing's chewing on them. But right now, the fall armyworm and the armyworm, they have a wide host range. They'll feed on just about any grass, corn, sweet corn, turf grass, just about brome, wheat, anything out there. So, and then if that's not available, they'll feed on soybeans or just about anything that's available. But they seem to prefer the grasses, and they can do a number on them. But remember, they don't transmit any diseases. They're chewers. They chew. So if your plants look like they're sick, it's not because of the worms. It's probably some sort of a virus or a pathogen out there. I get that question a lot.
If the worms are the problem for not great-looking grass, will it come back?
Yes. It's just like mowing it or grazing it with goats or cattle or horses. You know, it's and I've seen some places where I didn't think it would come back, but generally it does. Now, again, that depends on the health of the grass. If it's a crop that's struggling and if it's dry and drought conditions, and it may not. But if you water it and it's a good lawn and it's got a good root system anyway, yes, it's just like mowing it. They take the top part off.
Jeff, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime.
That was K-State crop entomologist Jeff Whitworth. You can find the Crop Insects in Kansas book linked in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or you can also find it by going to bookstore.ksre.ksu.edu. We're cutting to a short break now, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead.
From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. As the state continues to accumulate growing degree days rather quickly, corn silage harvest in Kansas is rapidly approaching. K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk says determining the right time to harvest corn silage will depend on a variety of factors. He says that includes corn maturity, whole plant moisture content, as well as the weather.
Today I want to visit with our Kansas dairy producers concerning corn silage harvest. As we've noticed, the cornfields around central Kansas have started to tassel, and many of them have been tasseling maybe for a couple of weeks now. So as we think about corn silage harvest, how far away is it, and what do we need to be planning for? So when we think about the tasseling stage to the actual harvest of corn silage, it is really going to be dependent on what kind of weather we have between now and then. It looks like it generally takes about 4 to 5 weeks for the corn to continue to mature after tasseling before we harvest for silage. However, this is heavily dependent on weather. This summer seems to be warmer than some, so we are accumulating growing degree days very quickly, so I anticipate that the corn will probably mature fairly quickly as we move through the next few weeks. The other issue that we have across much of the state is we do not have a lot of reserve moisture in the subsoil, so for dryland corn, we're extreme risk for drought, and if it turns off dry, that could speed up the maturity of the corn as well. So what are the key factors that you need to consider when you are trying to pull the trigger on when to harvest your corn silage? Well, very little has changed in the last few years, maybe a little more emphasis on the amount of starch that we might want to allow the kernel to develop before we harvest the corn for silage. You know, as we look back over the last 10 years, there's been a lot of recognition that about 25% of the total starch in the corn is actually formed as we go from about 1/2 milk line through black layer. So if you've traditionally been harvesting on the higher moisture side, generally looking at only maybe 30 to 32% dry matter for your trigger when you look at whole plant moistures, probably means that you were harvesting at about 1/2 milk line, maybe not even quite. So that means that you were giving up some starch when you did that. If you'd allow that crop to mature another week to 10 days, you would see a considerable increase in starch content. Now, when will this not be possible? Well, when we're having drought conditions or if the corn is drying very quickly, we need to be very concerned about whole plant moisture as well. We really do not want the whole plant moisture to exceed about 38%. And when we exceed 38%, it's going to be more difficult to pack. We'll generally see poor fermentation, and we may see increased spoilage as we feed out that silage phase over time. So moisture still trumps everything else when we look at trying to put up quality corn silage. You want to try to allow as much starch to form as possible and then pull the trigger at the right whole plant moisture content. A couple other things to keep in mind. Make sure you use an inoculant to increase the fermentation. And again, there are many different inoculants out there depending on what we're trying to do with the corn silage and the quality that we are trying to achieve. Making sure that we have enough pack density as we fill that silo becomes very important too during the harvest process, so we get excellent fermentation, and then covering the silage soon after the pile is completed or the bunker is completed so that we preserve as much of the quality as possible. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension, encouraging our farmers to start to gear up for corn silage harvest 2025.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.